My parents disowned me for being gay, so I bought their dream house out from under them. They threw me away for who I was, so I became everything they wanted and took the one thing they dreamed of. My name is Alex, and I'm 28 years old. This is the story of how I went from having nothing to having it all, just to watch the people who gave me life lose their dream. The air in our living room that night was thick with a silence I had learned to recognize. It was the silence that came before a storm, a heavy, expectant quiet that pressed down on my shoulders. I was 17, and for years I had been carrying a secret that felt like a lead weight in my gut. My parents, Mark and Susan, were people who believed in a very specific kind of order. A white picket fence, 2.5 kids, Sunday church, and a son who would one day bring home a pretty girl with a bright smile. I was their son, but I knew I would never be that boy in their picture-perfect future. The secret wasn't just about who I loved, it was about the fundamental, unbridgeable gap between the person they thought I was and the person I actually was. That night, the weight became too much to bear alone. The words tumbled out of me, clumsy and desperate, a confession I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head but had never dared to speak. I told them I was gay. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't expectant. It was empty, a vacuum where all the warmth and love I had known my entire life used to be. My father didn't yell at first. He just stared, his face a mask of stone, his eyes slowly turning from confusion to something cold and hard. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. It was the sound of a heart breaking, but it wasn't mine. The storm broke when my father finally found his voice. It wasn't a shout, but a low, venomous hiss that was far more terrifying. He spoke of sickness, of sin, of choices and perversions. He didn't look at me, he looked through me, as if I were a ghost who had just revealed its monstrous nature. My mother wept silently, her tears not for my pain, but for the death of her ideal son, the shattering of her carefully constructed world. The conversation was not a conversation, it was a verdict. They saw it not as a part of my identity, but as a moral failing, a stain on their family name that had to be scrubbed out. My father gave me an ultimatum, delivered with the chilling finality of a judge passing a death sentence. I could get help, renounce this lifestyle, and pray for forgiveness, or I could get out. He said they would not harbor sin under their roof. The choice, in his mind, was simple. But for me, it was no choice at all. I couldn't pray away the very core of who I was. I couldn't erase my feelings to fit into their narrow mold. So I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked to my room. The tears I had held back for years finally came, hot and silent, as I stuffed a backpack with a few clothes, a worn-out book, and the small amount of cash I had saved from my part-time job at the grocery store. Every sound from downstairs, the clink of a glass, my mother's muffled sobs, was a hammer blow to my soul. When I walked back into the living room, my father was standing by the front door, holding it open. He didn't look at me. He just pointed towards the outside world, a gesture that was more final than any words could be. My mother was nowhere in sight. As I stepped over the threshold, the door closed behind me with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the quiet suburban night, the sound of my old life ending. I stood on the sidewalk, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. The home I had known for 17 years was suddenly just a house, a fortress that had locked me out. I was 17, homeless, and completely alone in the world. The first few nights were a blur of fear and adrenaline. I slept in a 24-hour diner, hunched over a cup of coffee that I refilled for hours until the waitress would give me a look that said my time was up. I slept in a park once, curled up on a hard wooden bench, waking up every time a car drove by, my heart hammering against my ribs. The world, which had once seemed so full of possibility, had shrunk to the size of my backpack and the few dollars in my pocket. The initial shock gave way to a grinding, desperate survival mode. My first priority was a roof over my head, any roof. I remembered a kid from school, Leo, who I knew was gay and had been kicked out a year earlier. I found him through a mutual friend, and he took me in, letting me crash on his couch in a tiny, run-down apartment he shared with 2 other people. It was a temporary lifeline, a chaotic but safe space where I didn't have to hide. Leo's story was a harsh mirror of my own potential future, but it was also a beacon. He was surviving. He was working, going to community college, and building a life for himself piece by painful piece. He became my guide, my unofficial mentor in this new, uncharted territory. He helped me find a job, washing dishes in the back of a greasy spoon restaurant. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the pay was barely enough to cover my share of the rent and the cheap noodles that became my staple diet. My hands were constantly raw and wrinkled from the hot, soapy water. The smell of fried food and bleach clung to me, a scent I couldn't wash away. But it was a start. It was money. It was independence. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of work and sleep, punctuated by the gnawing ache of loneliness and the sharp sting of my parents' rejection. I tried not to think about them, but their voices, their judgment, echoed in the quiet moments. I'd see a happy family walking down the street, and a wave of something like grief would wash over me. But the anger was a more powerful fuel. The memory of my father's cold eyes and my mother's silent tears became a fire in my gut. I refused to be the victim they had cast me as. I refused to let them be right. If they thought I was a failure, I would become a success beyond their wildest dreams. I started taking classes at the local community college, paying for them with the little money I could save and a small grant I managed to secure. I chose a major in computer science, a field that seemed to promise a future built on logic and code, things that made sense, unlike the messy, unpredictable world of human emotions. Life became a brutal balancing act. I'd work the dinner shift at the restaurant, stumble home around 2 in the morning, try to cram in a few hours of studying, and then drag myself to my morning classes. I was fueled by caffeine and a deep, burning resentment. Every line of code I wrote, every exam I aced, was a small act of defiance. It was me telling them, without saying a word, that they hadn't broken me. The years were a blur of library cubicles, part-time jobs, and instant noodles. I moved from the couch to a tiny room of my own, a small, windowless box that I paid for with my own hard-earned money. It was the most liberating feeling in the world. I graduated from community college with honors and managed to get a scholarship to a 4-year university. The work got harder, the competition fiercer, but the fire inside me burned brighter. I was no longer just surviving. I was building. I was laying the foundation for a new life, one that didn't include them. One where my worth was determined by my own achievements, not by their approval. Years of blood, sweat, and tears were finally about to pay off, but I had no idea that my past was about to come knocking in the most unexpected way. Graduation day felt surreal. I stood there in a black cap and gown, a diploma in my hand that represented a battle I had fought and won entirely on my own. My parents weren't in the crowd. There was an empty space in the bleachers where a family should have been, a void that ached even amidst my triumph. But I pushed the feeling down and focused on the future. My hard work in college had paid off in ways I could have never imagined. I'd landed a coveted internship at a fast-growing tech startup in the city, a place that thrived on innovation and ambition. They didn't care about my background or who I loved, they only cared about what I could do, and I could do a lot. I threw myself into the work with the same obsessive drive that had gotten me through school. I was the first one in and the last one to leave. I lived and breathed algorithms and data structures. My colleagues saw me as quiet, intense, and incredibly driven. They didn't know the story behind the ambition, the ghost that pushed me to be better, faster, smarter. Within a few years, the startup went public. The stock options I had been granted as a junior employee, the ones I had almost forgotten about, suddenly exploded in value. Overnight, I went from having a comfortable salary to being a millionaire. It was a dizzying, life-altering shift. I bought a sleek, modern condo in the heart of the city with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. I traded in my beat-up old car for a new one. I bought expensive clothes and ate at restaurants where a single meal cost more than my monthly rent used to be. I had everything I thought I wanted. I had security, success, and financial freedom. But the anger was still there, a low, simmering hum beneath the surface of my new life. The money and the success were a shield, but they couldn't heal the deep wound of my parents' rejection. I was still the kid they had thrown away. One rainy Sunday afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, a "people you may know" suggestion popped up. It was my second cousin, someone I hadn't seen in over a decade. Curiosity, a dangerous and powerful thing, got the better of me. I clicked on her profile. Her page was a public window into a branch of my family that had moved on without me. And there, in a photo album from a recent family barbecue, were my parents. They looked older, a little grayer, but they were smiling. My father had his arm around my mother, and they looked happy. A fresh wave of pain and anger hit me so hard it felt like a physical blow. I started digging, clicking through tagged photos and public posts, piecing together the life they had built in my absence. I learned they had moved to a new town, that my father had been promoted at his job, and that they were active in their community. They were living the good life, the life they had always wanted, a life that seemingly didn't require a son at all. Then I found it, a post from my mother on a community forum. She was talking about their search for a forever home, the place where they would retire. She described it in loving detail, a charming 2-story colonial on a quiet street with a big backyard for gardening, a bay window in the living room, and a porch swing. She even included a link to the real estate listing. I clicked on the link, and my heart stopped. It was the most beautiful house I had ever seen. It was perfect. It was everything they had ever dreamed of. And in that moment, a plan began to form. A plan that wasn't about forgiveness, but about retribution. The next few weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. My work, which had always been my focus, became a background hum to the primary mission that consumed my every waking thought. The house. My parents' dream house. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol. It was the prize in a war they had started a decade ago. I began by creating a limited liability company, a shell corporation with a generic name like Oakwood Properties, LLC. This would be my mask, my way of operating without revealing my identity. I hired a high-end real estate agent from a neighboring city, someone who wouldn't know my parents or their social circle. I told her I was an out-of-state investor looking for a property, a quiet place to park some cash. The lie rolled off my tongue with a chilling ease. The agent, a sharp, professional woman named Sarah, was impressed by my decisiveness and my pre-approval for a substantial loan. She had no idea I was planning to pay in cash. My first step was to have Sarah schedule a private viewing of the house. I wanted to walk through it, to stand in the rooms my mother had fantasized about, to touch the banister my father had envisioned his grandchildren sliding down. The day of the viewing was crisp and clear. Sarah met me at the curb, her smile professional and welcoming. As she unlocked the front door, a wave of something strange washed over me. It wasn't excitement or even anger. It was a cold, calculated calm. The house was even more perfect than the picture showed. Sunlight streamed through the bay window my mother had described, illuminating the hardwood floors. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with granite countertops and brand new stainless steel appliances. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. I could almost hear the echoes of the life they had planned here. I stood in the master bedroom, looking out the window at the sprawling backyard. I imagined my mother planting her roses, my father mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. The images were a bitter poison in my mind. Sarah was giving me the standard real estate pitch, pointing out the new roof, the updated plumbing, the great bones of the house. I barely heard her. I was conducting my own reconnaissance. I was measuring the dimensions of their dream, calculating its worth, not in dollars, but in the currency of my pain. I learned from Sarah that the house had been on the market for a few weeks and that there was significant interest. In fact, she confided, an offer was expected any day now. She didn't have to say it for me to know. It was them. I could feel it. This was their moment. They were on the verge of getting everything they wanted, and I was about to take it away. The plan crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. I wouldn't just make an offer. I would make an offer they couldn't match, an offer so overwhelmingly good it would be impossible to refuse. I would use the very wealth they had driven me to acquire as the weapon of their destruction. I walked out of the house, the scent of fresh paint and new carpet clinging to my clothes, and I told Sarah I was very interested. I told her to be prepared for a very aggressive, all-cash offer to be submitted as soon as possible. The realtor looked at me, waiting for a decision. I knew my parents' offer was going in the next day. The clock was ticking. The next 24 hours were the most nerve-wracking of my life. The adrenaline that had fueled my climb from homelessness to success was back, but this time it was sharper, more focused. Every minute felt like an eternity. I sat in my pristine, minimalist condo, surrounded by the symbols of my success, and I watched the clock. I had instructed Sarah to submit the offer at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. My parents, I had learned through my digital snooping, were scheduled to have their own offer presented by their agent at 10. I had a 1-hour window to blindside them completely. I had my lawyer draft the paperwork. It was a clean, brutal document. An all-cash offer for 20% over the asking price, with no contingencies, no inspection period, and a closing date of their choosing. It was the kind of offer that made sellers' eyes pop out of their heads. It was an offer that was impossible to refuse. At 9:15, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her voice was buzzing with an energy that was almost giddy. The sellers had accepted. Instantly, they were ecstatic. They had canceled all other showings and were terminating all pending negotiations. My offer was the only one that mattered. I had done it. I had bought their dream house. The feeling that washed over me was not the euphoric triumph I had expected. It was colder than that. It was a quiet, profound sense of power. I had spent a decade feeling powerless, a victim of their prejudice and their cruelty. Now the tables had turned. I held all the cards. The next few days were a whirlwind of digital signatures and wire transfers. I didn't even have to go to the closing. My lawyer handled everything. It was all so sterile, so impersonal, which somehow made it even more satisfying. I wasn't just a person buying a house. I was a corporation, an entity, a force of nature that had descended upon their lives and altered their destiny. A week later, a set of 2 ornate brass keys arrived by courier in a plain, unmarked envelope. I picked them up. They were heavy in my hand, solid and real. These were the keys to the house on Elm Street, the house with the bay window and the porch swing, the house that was supposed to be my parents' sanctuary, their reward for a life well lived. And now it belonged to me. A stranger, a ghost from their past they had tried to erase. I sat at my kitchen table, turning the keys over and over in my hand. I thought about the phone call I would have to make, or the visit, The confrontation was the final piece of the puzzle, the closing act of this long, painful drama. I had to see their faces when they found out. I had to be there to witness the moment their dream crumbled into dust. I had the keys in my hand, but the final, most crucial part of the plan was yet to come. I had to face them. I didn't call them. A phone call would have been too easy, too impersonal. They deserved to see me, to look into the eyes of the son they had discarded and understand on a visceral level what they had lost. I drove to their town, a place I had never seen, a life I had not been a part of. The house on Elm Street was just as beautiful as I remembered. I parked my car down the street, out of sight, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Around noon, a familiar-looking sedan pulled into the driveway. My father got out of the driver's side, his hair more silver than I remembered, his shoulders a little more stooped. My mother emerged from the passenger side, her face etched with a hopeful, excited smile. They were dressed up as if for a special occasion. This was the day. This was the day they thought they were closing on their forever home. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and rage. They walked up to the front door, my father fishing for a key. He was probably meeting the real estate agent there for a final walkthrough before the official closing. He knocked. The door remained closed. He knocked again, a little louder this time, a flicker of confusion on his face. My mother peered through the bay window, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. That was my cue. I got out of my car and walked slowly, deliberately up the street towards them. They didn't notice me at first, their attention focused on the locked door. I stopped a few feet behind them, the keys in my pocket feeling like a lead weight. Looking for someone? My voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. They both turned around. The look on their faces was a masterpiece of slow dawning horror. First, there was simple confusion. Who was this stranger? Then, recognition. My father's face went pale, his jaw dropping slightly. My mother's hand flew to her chest, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was the same look she had given me 10 years ago, but this time it wasn't disappointment, it was shock. "Alex?" my mother whispered, my name a foreign word on her lips. I didn't answer. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out the 2 brass keys. I held them up, letting them catch the sunlight. The soft clinking sound was the only noise in the sudden, heavy silence. "The sellers accepted another offer," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "An all-cash offer. They were very eager to sell." My father stared at the keys, then at my face, his mind struggling to connect the dots, to process the impossible reality of the situation. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was dizzying. I was no longer the scared, desperate 17-year-old begging for their love. I was a man in control, a man holding their dream in the palm of my hand. "You threw me away because you thought I was a failure," I continued, my voice finally gaining a hint of the anger I had suppressed for so long. "You thought you were erasing a mistake, but you were wrong. You threw away the one person who would one day be able to give you exactly what you wanted. The irony is, I didn't do this for you. I did it for me. I did it for the 17-year-old kid you left on the street with nothing but a backpack." I let the keys fall from my hand and jingle on the welcome mat at their feet. "Welcome to my neighborhood," I said, and then I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, speechless and shattered, on the porch of the home they would never own. Driving away, I expected to feel euphoric, triumphant, but the feeling that washed over me was something else entirely. The drive back to the city was silent. The roar of victory I had anticipated never came. Instead, a profound and unsettling hollowness settled in my chest. I had won. I had executed my plan with surgical precision. I had watched the confusion and horror dawn on their faces, and I had walked away the victor. But the battlefield was empty, and the spoils of war felt cold and heavy in my hands. I had bought a house I didn't want, using money I had earned out of spite to hurt people who were, in the end, just two deeply flawed, narrow-minded humans. The anger that had been my fuel for a decade had finally burned itself out, and in its place was just ash. For the next few weeks, the house on Elm Street sat empty. I received letters from the HOA about the unmowed lawn and the tiled-up mail. The house, once the symbol of my ultimate revenge, had become a burden, a monument to a pain I was no longer sure how to process. I would drive by sometimes, just to look at it. I'd see my parents' car parked down the street, watching it like ghosts haunting a place they could never enter. It didn't bring me satisfaction. It just made me sad. I thought about the 17-year-old kid I used to be, the one who just wanted his parents to love him. That kid wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for a home. And in my quest for retribution, I had forgotten that. One evening, I was scrolling through a newsfeed when an article caught my eye. It was about a local shelter for LGBTQ+ youth who had been kicked out of their homes. The article described their struggle for funding, their constant need for more beds, more food, more counselors to help kids who were going through the exact same thing I had gone through. A picture accompanied the article, a teenager, no older than I had been, sitting on a cot in a crowded room, looking lost and alone. And in that moment, something inside me finally shifted. It was like a lock clicking open. This was it. This was the answer. The house wasn't a weapon to be used against my parents. It was a resource. It was a tool. The next morning, I called my lawyer and my real estate agent. I told them I wanted to sell the house. But I had a condition. I found a non-profit organization that worked with homeless youth and arranged for them to purchase the house from my LLC at a fraction of its market value. The rest of the value, the massive profit I stood to make, I donated to them outright. It was the single largest donation they had ever received. The organization was stunned. The local news did a story on it. Anonymous benefactor donates dream house to youth shelter, the headline read. The house on Elm Street, my parents' dream home, was transformed. The bedrooms were filled with bunk beds. The pristine kitchen was used to cook hot meals for scared, hungry kids. The big backyard, where my mother had envisioned her roses, became a safe space for young people to play and heal. I never told anyone it was me. The satisfaction I got from that act was 1,000 times more potent than the empty feeling of my revenge. It wasn't about punishing my parents anymore. It was about redeeming their mistake. They threw away a child, and in return, I created a home for dozens more. I never spoke to my parents again. I heard through the grapevine that they eventually moved away, unable to bear living in the same town as the house that had become a symbol of their greatest loss. I hope they found some peace. I know I did. I learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the family you choose, the home you build for yourself, and the people you lift up along the way. My parents tried to build their forever home on a foundation of judgment and exclusion. I built mine on a foundation of resilience and ultimately compassion. And mine, I think, will last a lot longer.